Ahmed. I'm a lead software engineer at DICE, which is EA. I'm also a designer. I'm Egyptian and I'm Dutch, like the presenter before me, Sven. I'm also a father. I've got a 2.5-year-old son, and I have a podcast, which I'll share a link of later, so maybe you can listen into that sometimes. I've been making interfaces for about 15 years now. I started by making apps for Windows back when we were called GUI programmers. I made apps for New York Stock Exchange, Vodafone, and companies like Siemens and Microsoft for Windows. I then joined a digital agency where we made phone apps and iPad apps and websites for brands like Nivea and Philips. And these are usually big companies that don't know much about technology per se, like app development. They have their own expertise, so they hired us to develop these experiences for their websites and apps. In 2013, I moved to games, so I worked on Killzone Shadowfall, which was a launch title for PS4. It's a great game you might have heard of. Then I stayed to ship Killzone Shadowfall Intercept, which is a co-op experience. And in 2017, I worked on a game called Horizon Zero Dawn. Some of you might have heard of this. And I also did the expansion to that called The Frozen Wilds. In 2019, I moved over to DICE in Stockholm, and I worked on Battlefield 5. And most recently, I've finished the live service of Star Wars Battlefront 2, which was a great game to work on. I want to touch upon a nuance when you're developing an experience for multiple devices. So these brands, they usually asked us to develop a website, a tablet app, and a phone app. So when you're designing an experience for a desktop in the form of a website, let's say, you can make assumptions about what the user is experiencing and how he's experiencing this website. So for instance, on a desktop, you know that the user is possibly or is sitting at a desk. They also might sit at this desk for an hour or more. They're also not often interrupted by people, so they're just watching the screen on a desktop. If somebody is experiencing your software on a laptop, it's similar to a desk, but they could be somewhere else. So they could be at a coffee shop. They're usually using the laptop the same period as a desktop, maybe a bit shorter, and they're also usually not interrupted. When you're designing for a tablet, you can assume that people will hold the tablet for 10 to 20 minutes. They might be sat on a sofa and they could get interrupted by people walking through the room. And on the phone, people usually look at their phone for a few minutes. They can be on the move. So imagine somebody waiting for a bus. If you're making an app for a phone, you have to know that this person can look away from your app at any time, so they can be interrupted by things. And these are all things that you keep in mind when you're designing an experience for different devices. In the industry, mobile industry or service industry, digital service industry, we had terms for this. So an experience where somebody is very focused on a screen for a long time, we call that a leaned in experience. Whereas somebody glancing at their phone or looking at their smartwatch is a leaned out experience. So it's something that somebody is not very immersed in. They just look very quickly and then can get distracted. So these examples are how it relates to a web app or a mobile app. In this talk, I'm going to be talking about how I took this experience into the games industry, and hopefully that will help you design for players instead of users of websites and apps. So yeah, I'm going to take this to show you how this can be applied to a game like Horizon. Before I do that, I want to define a couple of terms, and these will help us talk about what players could be experiencing. So you can see these as two variables. One of them is immersion. So immersion is how immersed a player is in gameplay. So imagine a player that is aiming at a target that's moving on the screen. This is a person that's very immersed in that gameplay moment. And so the immersion level in a situation like that would be very high. Absorption is the amount of UI the player is capable of absorbing while they are playing. So you can imagine that same player that is aiming at an enemy or at another player doesn't have a lot of capacity to read a lot of information in the form of text or icons. And these two terms will help us reason about what the player is experiencing in a moment. These two terms, these two things, if they're variables, you can say that they're inversely proportional, which means that the more immersed the player is, the closer they are to gameplay or something very serious in the game, the less information they can absorb. And the other way around, if they are doing something which is very far from gameplay, then they can absorb more information. What inversely proportional also means is that if you were to plot this on a graph, you can do it on one axis. So in the top of that graph, you could put an experience where a person is very immersed but cannot absorb information. And in the bottom, you can plot stuff where the player is not immersed at all but can absorb a lot of information. Another way to look at this is if what the player is experiencing is represented on a bar like this. If you have a game where there's only gameplay and no UI at all, so just the game, then the player will only be experiencing the gameplay. So that's the dark part of the bar here. If you introduce UI to the player on top of the game, it will take up some of their experience. So here you can see an example of a player that might be experiencing the game, but there is UI on the game. There could also be situations where there's a lot of UI or a lot of text, and you can imagine a situation, for instance, where a player is playing a game like Skyrim and they're reading about lore in this game in one of the books that he finds in the world. This is a moment where the player is really focused on a lot of UI and not really focused on the game behind the UI. So this is a good way to try to visualize these different states that the player can be in. So imagine like the device types that I talked about earlier. So the desktop, the laptop, the tablet, and the phone. We have 4 different players or personas, and they are all experiencing different parts of the game, and they are in different states. And you can see here the bars, how they represent these states. So in the top left, you have a player that is very focused on gameplay and maybe just has some UI on the screen, like a reticule or something, and they can really focus on the gameplay. Top right, you can see a girl that is less immersed in the game and can absorb more information. And the bottom left is somebody even less immersed and is maybe seeing more UI. And in the bottom right, you can see a person who is just reading the UI and not looking at the game at all. So these are 4 categories that we can reason about, and we can think about what players are experiencing in those categories. We can also give these categories names. So just like the terms that we had in the mobile industry, we can give them names to make it easier to speak about these categories or these personas. So here I gave them some names. In the top left, you see leaned in, the same as I showed before. And in the bottom right, you see leaned out. And then I came up with 2 terms in the middle just to make it easier to talk about these people. You can also write user stories, which people might know from agile development. A user story is just something that describes what a player could be experiencing or a user can be experiencing. It helps us make decisions about our designs. And in the top left here, I wrote a user story about the leaned in persona. This is somebody who's really focused on the core gameplay loop. So let's say it's a combat game, they're focused on the loop. They only want to see UI when it's very necessary to what they're trying to do. Lean forward is somebody who's focused on one of the game's other pillars. So maybe not one of the core pillars, but another pillar in the game. And they're okay with seeing UI if it enriches their experience. The lean back persona is somebody that might want to see more information about the situation they're in. They like to see things that help them be better players and enjoy themselves more. And in the last category, you have a person that might not be worried about gameplay at all. They just want to read the information and they want to see as much as they can about the game, but not the gameplay, just the game in general. So these kind of user stories helps us reason about these personas and helps us make design decisions as well. So now to take this idea, this concept that we just discussed that came from my experience in mobile development, and with these variable names and categories that we just defined into a game like Horizon. Horizon Zero Dawn, for the people that have not played it, it's an open world action RPG. It's set in a post-apocalyptic America. And in the story, you follow a girl called Aloy while she faces big robots like you see in this picture here. And she tries to unravel the mysteries of her past. So what I'm going to do in the next section, I'm going to talk a bit about the game and hold a short retrospective to see if we can use this concept that I talked about before to improve the game Horizon as it is now on the shelves. So now that we have these 4 categories defined, so they have names and they have user stories, a good exercise to do is to have a look at some games, do some research, and find situations where the players could be in one of these categories. So here I've looked at games that are similar to Horizon, or I've looked at Horizon itself. So we start by looking at a leaned-in example. So this is an example of the weapon wheel in Horizon Zero Dawn. You can see that the player still has control of Aloy. They're walking around in the environment, and this UI is there to switch out the ammo type or the weapon that she is holding, the player character is holding. So the user in this case is okay with seeing this UI because it really helps them trying to achieve what they're doing. So imagine you're fighting a boss and you run out of ammo. Opening this wheel is very necessary to enjoying the game. So that's why it's in the leaned in category. In the leaned forward category, I've taken an example from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, an amazing game by Ubisoft. And you can see here a situation where the player is walking through a city and they're interacting with a merchant or a blacksmith. So this is one of the side pillars of the game, exploration or walking around in a city. The person is not in combat. But here you can see that the game is still running. The game is not paused, just like in Horizon, but the player cannot control the character anymore. But they can still see the world around the character. They can hear all the sounds. They see people walk around in the city. So this is an example of a leaned forward UI. For a leaned back example, I've taken an example from Zelda Breath of the Wild. You can see here that the player is opening their inventory. The game is paused when they open their inventory, but you can still vaguely see it through the background, blurred and darkened. But here the focus is more on the UI, and this is UI that helps the person become a better player. So for instance, you can read some information about the weapon the player is selecting, or about their outfit, and this is information that can help the player be a better player. So this is a leaned back example. And for a leaned out example, I've taken another example from Horizon. Here you see the inventory, but in Horizon. And here the game is paused as well, just like in Zelda. But the game is not visible at all. The player is totally taken out of the game. They're taken very far from the gameplay. And in this case, the player in this menu can read about the lore and can do anything in the game far away from the gameplay. So this is a leaned out example. So now that we've have a couple of examples that we have shown, we can make short checklists that identify the UI that is shown in these different categories. So in the top here, like I said before, the game is running. The player can still control the character. He can also control the UI to select a weapon. The game is very visible. The music is the same. The sound effects are the same. There's not a lot of big chunks of text, but there's icons to communicate with the player. So these are some characteristics of the example that we chose for a leaned in interface. For leaned forward, the game is also still running. The people are walking around the player. The music is the same, and the same goes for the sound effects. Half of the game is visible, so the player is still connected to what's going on in the world. Also, there's a majority of icons and maybe some more text than in the previous example. In the lean back example, like we showed in Zelda, the game is paused, so the game is not running. The player can only control the UI, but the player can still see the game somewhat behind the UI. They also see a representation of the character in the UI, which keeps them kind of close to the gameplay. And they can still hear the in-game music, but no more sound effects, just the sound effects that play when you're interacting with the UI. Also, there's a lot of icons, just like in the previous two sections, but there's also a lot of text to help the player improve how they play. In the leaned out example, the game is also paused. The player only controls the UI. You cannot see the game at all. There's only UI music that is playing, so the actual music from the game is fading out, and you only hear a special music made for the UI. And it's also a lot of text and icons. So these are some 4 checklists that kind of describe in general what those 4 categories of players will see when they're playing games that I showed here. So the way these checklists can be used is when you're introducing a new UI feature to the game, you can reason about which type of personality or persona should be seeing this feature. And when you've chosen the category the UI will be shown in, you already have some kind of guidelines of how the UI will look like, how the music will behave. And this is very useful when you're trying to design a cohesive UI. But you can also use these checklists to make a big artifact. And I've done this here for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So what I've done, I've looked at Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and I've taken all the UI features that I could find, or all the gameplay features that show some sort of UI, and I've put them on a one-axis graph here. So in the top, you can see a UI that is shown when the player is very immersed in the game and is not capable of absorbing information in the form of text or icons. And in the bottom, the opposite. And you can see here the 4 categories as we talked about them. And what I've done is I've taken each gameplay feature that shows some UI or a UI feature, and I've looked at this checklist that we made just a second ago and categorized them. And you can see very quickly here that things like toggle your melee weapon or toggle your range weapon, which are 2 features that are very close to combat, are up in the top. And in the bottom, you see things like the settings menu and the DLC store, which are features that you might access a couple of times in your whole play experience. So Assassin's Creed is a game you can play for 100 hours, but you will probably only set your settings once or twice in those 100 hours. So you can see that's why it fits in a logical way for it to be in the bottom. If we do the same for Horizon Zero Dawn, as you can buy it now in the stores, you get this artifact. And what you can see here is very quickly, at a glance, you can see that the middle 2 categories don't have a lot of features in them. And even though this is not the reason for this exercise, it's still good to look at it this way to see if your UI is balanced correctly or not. And you can see here that the settings is, for instance, higher than equipping your weapon, which can be perceived as a problem. So now, in order to equip your weapon in Horizon, you have to open the menu, which is a full screen menu, take over, and you have to tab to your inventory to equip a weapon. And that is very far away from the gameplay. So what I've done here next is I've taken all the features as they are in Horizon and I've rearranged them. You can see the green ones are the ones that were promoted, that went to a section higher. The red ones are the ones that I demoted. So you can see that equip weapon and outfit is now higher than the settings menu. And this is something that you can do on paper without having to do anything in an editor. You can just list all your features in your categories and reason about them again, replace them in a new section. And then a good way to move forward with this is to then try to group as much of these changes as possible in one change. So instead of rebuilding the whole UI, maybe you can group a couple of these changes, feature changes in a single change. And that's something that I will talk about now. So here's an example of the button scheme in Horizon Zero Dawn. When you press the options button, which is the small button on the gamepad, you get a pause menu. You see that here. The game is visible in the background, but the game is paused. If you hit the touchpad, you open the map, and this is where you can access your inventory and all the things where you can equip weapons and things like that. So that's like I mentioned before, you have to open a leaned out UI to access something that is very close to gameplay. So a good way to try to optimize this would be, for instance, to take all the features that are far from the gameplay, like for instance, here is the quest log. Put it on the small button on the controller. So this is only the leaned out UI that we have there. We still open the quest log as a first page because it's close to the narrative kind of the game. And what we could do is split the touchpad into 2 buttons. one of the buttons could open a character screen. And this character screen here you can see is already closer to the gameplay. When you press that, the game pauses, but you still see the game in the background. You can maybe quickly equip a weapon here without being removed from the game too much. And we can also still keep the map on the different side of the touchpad, because the map is still important for the game, as in to help the player navigate where they want to go. We could also allow tabbing between these two to make it to cover for the fact if somebody presses the wrong side, which happens often when you split touchpad in half. So what we've done here is we've taken this concept from the mobile industry and applied it to a game and improved it. So how can we do something like this for a game like Battlefield? So for the people that have not played Battlefield, Battlefield is a sandbox shooter. It's a shooter where you can drive tanks, you can jump from planes in a parachute, you can use many different types of gadgets and weapons. And these are all really amazing features that are built by very talented people, but the game doesn't teach the player very well how to use them. And one of the first things I was tasked with when I joined DICE was to help onboard the player and teach them these amazing features that people made. So what I'm going to do next is talk a bit very briefly about how we can use a process like the one I talked about before to improve onboarding for the player. So here is a gameplay pacing chart. This is a chart that most game designers are familiar with. It's a page directly from Yunova Chan's playbook. He wrote a thesis about this. And so what it does is it plots the player's anxiety over time. So you can see 3 sections in this graph. You can see if the game becomes very intense very quickly without giving the player time to learn, they can reach a state of anxiety and leave the game. And the other way around, if the intensity builds up too slowly, when the player becomes too skilled, the player can get bored. And you see that in the lower section here. And the idea is that when gameplay designers are trying to pace a game, they're trying to hit this flow section. If I map the multiplayer experience as it is in Battlefield 5, this is what it looks like. So you can see a big spike when a person joins a multiplayer round and they get shot at by 32 players. And then there's a brief dip when the game loads to the next map. So what we can see here is that multiplayer is not the right place to teach people about the game. So the idea is to reach this kind of state. So that's why we decided to do onboarding in the practice range. We have this place called the practice range where people can go and shoot their guns and try their vehicles. Here you can see a example of the shooting range. So this is a safe environment where the person can try the game without having enemies. So now that we know where we want to onboard the player, how do we do it? This is a tooltip that we have in Battlefield 5 now, and we show this at any time while the player is playing. So even when they are on fire, we tell them to prone to put out their fire, and this is something that might not be paced correctly. So what I'm going to talk about now is how we can use these personas to improve pacing of this information and revise it a bit. So for instance, if a player is aiming, this might not be the right time to show any UI to teach the player something, because they're very focused on hitting the target. So that would be a leaned in example. Here is an example of leaned forward. So this is when a player just picked up a bazooka or a tool So we can show them a very short text here to explain that this is used against vehicles. And because it's a moment when the player is still in the practice range, just picked up the tool, wants to get a feel for it, we can show a little bit of information there. If the player is standing in front of the tool, we can fade out the HUD and show a bit more information. So here is a example of a leaned back UI where we show a short video of what the tool does and how it's used. And here's an example of a leaned out UI. So this could be if the player dies or if the player is loading, we can show some more information about how this tool is used. So here you can see that if you hit the turret with the bazooka, the turret cannot aim. If you hit the engine, you do critical damage. And if you hit the tracks, the tank cannot move anymore. So these are 4 examples of how to show information or not show information in these 4 categories or states the player is in. So to summarize what I've done here to improve the pacing, I've defined a couple of variables, immersion and absorption. You don't have to use the same ones. You can define ones that that fit better with your game. I've created personas, split the categories, split those variables into 4 categories, and given them names to make it easier to talk about them with stakeholders. I've written short user stories about those categories to make it easier again to talk about them and to explain them to people that might not be familiar with UI design. We've made some checklists and we've done some research. So we've looked at different games and we've made checklists to kind of describe the characteristics of the UIs that are going to be shown in those 4 categories. And again, these checklists are very useful when you're trying to introduce new UI, or they can be used to create an artifact. This artifact, in this case, was on 1 axis, but if your variables are not inversely proportional, it could be a 2-axis chart. We've made an artifact which made it very easy for us to have an overview on the features. And next, we've optimized that artifact. So we've moved stuff around in this artifact and figured out what we want to change and how we want to change it. And the next step would be to then make a prototype and play test it, of course. And this is a step I think you are all familiar with, so I won't go into detail there. So yeah, that was my talk. If you have any cool artifacts that you make, be sure to email them to me. Here's my personal email and my work email. You can also find me on Twitter. I'd like to thank some people that helped me prepare this talk. So Leonard is a system designer at Guerrilla Games. He helped me a lot coming up and crystallizing this process, coming up with it, and I used him for a lot of feedback. Eric is the UX lead at DICE. I also got a lot of good feedback from him. Amy is my girlfriend. She drew those amazing pictures that you saw of the personas. I asked her to draw them for me for this talk. And Luke drew this nice picture of me, so I decided to add his name as well. Yes, so you can contact us, find us. We're hiring people. We're always looking for good people. Give me a message, and we can look if you're interested in a job. And thank you for listening, and enjoy DevGAMM. I think it was a very amazing experience to do this online, and it's amazing that people were able to take this conference online so quickly. And here is a link of an article I wrote about this process. So if you want to read more about it, scan this code or follow that link, and you can read more about my process and into more detail. So thank you very much. I hope you learned something from this, and just contact me if you have anything to show me, and I'm here to answer any questions that you might have.